Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say that I am very aware that all of our minds are on something else today. I won't call it the elephant in the room, since this is Ithaca, after all. But thank you for taking time out of this day, and with a long night ahead, I think, of all of us probably waiting to hear how it turns out. As my very kind introducer mentioned, I have had I've been fortunate in having times at the Society for the Humanities, and in fact I began this book on a year's fellowship at the Society in, I think it was 2008 to 2009. And then I came back, other things intervened, including another book, but I came back and was able to finish it during my time at Cornell in 2011 to 12 as the Abrams Professor. And although the final work was done in Rome, when I, again, was very fortunate in having access to Twombly's books and his archive, I feel I owe a great deal to Cornell, the time and the space to work. And I really would like to acknowledge the libraries, the help of Olin Library and the Fine Arts Library in completing the book, and also Kroc Rare Books, who produced some of the photographs that I needed, one of them in incredibly quick time when I was being refused an image by the Matisse Foundation, who were very particular about images, and they turned out to have the journal that had the image I wanted, which was great. So thank you to Olin and Kroc and the Art Library, Fine Arts Library. Now, since this is a library talk, I thought I really would focus on books, but I just want to say that the book, which many copies are over there, in case you want to look at it, and I have an open copy for anybody who just wants to look through the pages, which I will send around if you like. So I'll just send it around. But what I'm going to do is something very close in to books today, but there are chapters on Twombly and war, on landscape, on the pastoral. Twombly is very interested in pastoral poetry and pastoral generally, and his response to some of the auratic Renaissance paintings in Rome, and other aspects of his work. So please don't go away with the idea that it's all this sort of very close textual work. Nonetheless, I found it, I kind of wrote the book backwards because I found all this material towards the end and was just amazed at how it confirmed some of my guesses about, for instance, editions he'd used, but how closely he worked with the books. And I will come back to that. And you have, I think you should have a handout which will perhaps offer you some of the passages I'm going to talk about. Now, I just want to quickly say, for those of you who don't know anything about Twombly, he was born in 1928 in Lexington, Virginia, and I think he always felt he was a Southerner. He always felt he came from the South. He then went north. He went to art school in both Boston and New York, and then went, crucially, and I'll come back to that, to Black Mountain College with his friend Robert Rauschenberg. His first trip to Rome on a fellowship was in the early 1950s. He loved it, clearly, and always wanted to go back. His national service intervened, but he did finally get back in the late 50s, and then he settled there. But he was always going to and fro between New York and sometimes Lexington and Italy. He was, of course, one of a trio. His close friend, Rauschenberg, they remained very close friends, and, of course, Jasper Johns. So the three of them, and Cy Twombly was in a way the outlier, the one who went off to Europe and seemed not to be developing in the same way as either Rauschenberg or Johns. And I think that gives him a very interesting, kind of edgy relation to American art, and may perhaps explain why, until the last few decades, his work has been much less celebrated in America than it was in Europe. So that's a little sort of potted location of Twombly. Now, Twombly, of course, is has said quite a bit about his own relation to poetry. For instance, he said, "I like poets because I can find a condensed phrase. I always look for the phrase." Very interesting remark, I think. I think a lot of people associate Twombly with these huge abstract blackboard paintings, for instance, enormous grey canvases covered in looping cursive, this roiling cursive. And also the scratched and incised graffiti on his off-white canvases. But the marks, of course, that most intrigued me were his quotations, phrases and lines of poetry scrawled on paintings, drawings, collages, and sculptures in his inimitable handwriting. As a literary critic, and I'm not an art historian or an art critic, I was curious about Twombly's poetry. I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to reflect on how he used it in his work. The Twombly fandom online sometimes assumes that a particularly resonant phrase by Twombly was quoted by Twombly, was authored by Twombly himself. Not so, though I think he does make these phrases his in some ways, sometimes by editing them, and a sort of ventriloquism arises. So that the viewer is often tempted to ask questions like, well, why does he choose? Why does the painter choose a specific passage? What was he thinking about? What kind of internal dialogue are we overhearing? But Reading Cy Twombly isn't a biographical study, and it's not really psychobiographical, though I do have one chapter where it gets a little bit closer to psychoanalysis. I deliberately did not want to write a biographical or psychobiographical study. I didn't think it was appropriate. But I did want to address the aesthetics of Twombly's use of poetry in his art. So my overarching questions, and they're transferable questions, are something like, what have words and writing to do with painting and drawing? What does it mean to read an artwork? Maybe paradoxical, the idea of reading an artwork. Now, poetry figures in interesting ways from the start in accounts of Twombly's work. One of his very earliest mentors called him a poet in paint. Now, the phrase a poet in paint actually originates in an essay by Baudelaire, an essay which refers to the work of Delacroix, the epitome of 19th century modernity. Later, the poet Octavio Paz responded to Twombly's work by reminding us that Baudelaire had called the painter a universal translator. And he had in mind the translations made by the painter in images, but also the quote, translations, autonomous translations of the art critic in writing about art, which I think was something that intrigued me as I was working. What did art writing have to do with art? Through Twombly's relation to poetry, I really wanted to interrogate one received idea of Twombly as timelessly humanistic and mythopoeic as an artist. I wanted to underline his modernity, his contemporary engagement with politics and indeed with war. Tracking the books he used leads back to his formative period at Black Mountain College, as I mentioned earlier, around about 1950. That was an extraordinary gathering of artists, writers, dancers, sculptors, presided over then in a rather chaotic but powerful fashion by the poet Charles Olson. I think it's important to mention that Twombly never took a course with Charles Olson, with Big O, as he was known. He was a big man. Although Olson greatly admired Twombly and talked to him quite a bit, he admired Twombly, he said, for his line. And he wrote a rather over-the-top encomium for him, which compared him to the founder of the great Sumerian library, Ashur-burnipal, if I'm pronouncing that right. At the heart of Ulson's pedagogy was a Poundian aesthetic of the fragment, the phrase, the verse line, and a taste for the poetic past, sometimes the archaic poetic past. The so-called Pound anthology shaped Twombly's literary taste. You might say it fixated it. Pound's ABC of Reading, written in the 1930s, laid out a very ambitious program of reading for the student of poetry, and his iconoclastic and eclectic guide to culture, also 1930s, late 1930s, was a central part of Ulson's curriculum. So what I want to just sort of suggest here is that the Poundian, the effect of Pound's 20th century modernism on the literary taste, the formative moment of Twombly's taste, was very important. At Black Mountain College, Twombly discovered both the poetry of the past and 20th century literary modernism, poets like Rilke and Mallarmé. Mallarmé, perhaps someone he was introduced to by his teacher, Motherwell, who was a proponent of automatic writing, of Dada and collage. This rich confluence of ancient and modern poetry occurred under the aegis of the importation of mid-20th century Dada to New York. Motherwell did a famous anthology of Dada. So spliced, remixed, anti-canonical quotations from poetry become a kind of ready-made when they're brought into the artwork. It's as though a bit of the world enters the artwork, as in Rauschenberg's Combines, where he brings the head of a goat into the picture. Now, I said I was going to talk about Twombly's books. So there they are. Those are shelves I know well and was privileged to raid, if you can use that word. You can see that the environment in which Twombly slept, which was his so-called library, was covered with books. Mostly three sides of it were art books, and one side was literature. The flying sculpture is not by Twombly, of course. This is part of a photo essay by Tacitus Dean, who did a wonderful essay of his environment at Gaeta, his house overlooking the Bay of Gaeta between Rome and Naples. And it was a photograph she never published because it had an awkward blur in the corner, so it is cropped by her studio. I feel very lucky to have that picture. His books included Sappho and the Greek Bronze Age poets, Theocritus and Greek pastoral poetry, Ovid and Virgil, Horace, Catullus, Spenser, Keats, T.S. Eliot, of course, and Pound, and the 20th century Greek poets, C.P. Cavafy and George Seferis. I'll come back to Rilke and Pessoa. I think those are the core names. Now, marked up passages and paint stains in Twombly's book show that he often worked quite literally with the book in his hand, editing as he worked. What I'm going to do is show you 3 very detailed case studies from my introduction, and each touches on a different aspect of Twombly's practice, as well as foregrounding what I take to be some of the overarching concerns of his work. Memory, memorialization would be one. Another would be erotic vision and concealment. And finally, the depredations of time and the material erosion of the work. So to take the first, there on the other shore, which is a quotation, Twombly's quotations often produce what I might call a kind of subjectivity effect, an imaginary persona capable of looking back across time and space. But, of course, poetry also speaks to the there-ness of there, if you like, to the visible trace of the artist's one time only marking of the canvas or the page. It draws attention to the indexical marks of the artist's hand, the onceness of the act of marking. During the 1990s, Twombly drew on a series of passages from the Greek poet George Seferis' elusive and highly personal 3 secret poems, originally written in the 1960s. He used a little-known translation by someone called Rice's, a paperback called Greek Poetry Translations, published in the 80s. And that's what you see there. Seferis, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for his poetry, as you probably know, is profoundly intertwined with, profoundly concerned with the intertwining of past and present in the Mediterranean, in Mediterranean history. He called it mythisterema. I won't go into that now, but I think he's an extremely interesting poet, not well served by his translators, at least by this translator. He later had better translators. So Twombly's markings, scribbles, revisions, and paint show him quarrying and editing his paperback edition of Seferis for a series of linked paintings belonging to 1993 to 4. And this was a rather critical moment because the paintings he was doing then were going to appear in his, either alongside or in his 1994 retrospective at MoMA. There were 2 versions of the Quattro Stagioni, the 4 seasons, and then there was the huge, up till then unfinished, Say Goodbye, Catullus, to the Shores of Asia Minor, which only got its title then in 1994. Previously it's simply called Unfinished Painting. It now hangs, it's now the sort of huge, overwhelming presence in the Renzo Piano Cy Twombly Pavilion in Houston at the Menil. The nexus for this series of intertwined paintings was another painting, Twombly's memorial painting for his gallerist who had died, his gallerist Lucio Amelio. It's called Untitled, painting of 1993. 2 funerary boats, by then a kind of shorthand for some of Twombly's concerns, alight with flaming torches, topped and tailed with passages from Seferis' 3 secret poems, float across the canvas. And here is a page from Seferis, annotated. You can see boat for Lucio, boat for Lucio. And I want you to notice this passage. The light is a pulse, continually slower and slower. You think it's about to stop. These are the passages of gloomy text that Twombly repurposed. He called them gloomy texts. He actually said, I can't remember where they came from. He knew perfectly well where they came from. The light is a pulse, continually slower and slower. You think it's about to stop. And he also marked and then included in the painting the lines, years ago you said, fundamentally, I am a matter of light. Lucio, the dead gallerist. Of course, for the artist, light and life coincide as the sun's pulse slows towards death. On another page, Twombly rises metrically predictable midline caesura, using a very drastic Poundian method, cutting the second half of each line. And here it is. So he wanted that passage, and this is the passage he includes in the memorial painting for his gallerist. Yet there on the other shore, under the black glance, sun's in your eyes, you were there, of the other labor, the other dawn, the other birth, yet you were, in time successive, moment by moment, like. So a drastic scissoring, and it's actually 1 on your handout. I'll show you, I think that's pretty much what you have in your handout. Okay, you can see what he's done. He's simply cut the second half of each line. And you can compare, I hope I'm not going too fast, but you can compare the detail, yet there on the other shore, under the black glance, suns in your eyes. You were there at the other labor, the other dawn, the other birth, yet there you were in time successive, moment by moment, like. So that's the passage that we saw floating around at the top here, okay? Just to go back to there. So he's scissored this and allowed it to become much more evocative, incomplete, indeed a fragment with its dangling like, getting rid of all the personal details in Seferis' poem, sound like T.S. Eliot on a bad day, pain, love, presence, resurrection, and so forth, along with the two specific stalactites and stalagmites, produces a kind of unmoored, floating memory as memorial. Twombly repurposed the same lines the next year when he was trying to finish the large painting I mentioned, Say Goodbye, Catullus. And here is the passage, now reinscribed on one of the panels of this huge 3-panel painting. Now there's been a shift in meaning, I think, as if to emphasize the expansion of time. Here's the passage inscribed on a blank space with the words vast, vast, and time greatly expanded, and then tinily, drop by drop, underneath. So it's as if, in this case, the recycling of the passage suggests that a kind of composite form of memory is a shorthand for memory itself, as the vast expanse of the painting looks back across the Mediterranean past, and with it to the artist's life and work. I haven't time to talk about it now, but I have pictures at the end I can come back to if anybody's interested, to suggest the way this painting kind of moves backwards in time, as it were, from the present to a distant past, which is also Twombly's own past, as well as a historical Mediterranean past. Now, the Seferis of 3 secret poems is the quintessential poet of secrecy. He encrypts private references and allusions to his own poetry, along with references to Greek politics and his own nightmares. He began 3 secret poems in his mid-60s, the same age that Twombly was when he read it, as a sort of personal accounting of his own life. He wrote, "Your life is what you've given, this void is what you've given, the blank page." And I'm sure Twombly was drawn to the blank page. It's a passage he emphatically marked in his copy. I just want to say a little bit more about secrecy. Defining the way his poems were secret, Seferis came up with a series of terms. Secretive, yes, but not secret in the sense of mystica, not mystical. Seferis' poetry may have appealed to Twombly's own tendency to encode private meanings in his work. I think it's worth thinking about that Twombly did his national service at the Pentagon in the Cold War era of cryptography, which was being built up as an enormous numbers of people started to work for the Pentagon on cryptography. We're seeing something like that today, I think. During his weekends off, from his work this was his national service, he practiced automatic drawing in the dark. He learned stenography, and he commented that he was totally unsuited to the work because of his own vagueness. He used the word vagueness. And he was, in fact, let go by a kindly board after he had a breakdown caused by anxiety. He found the work enormously anxious in case he did something wrong. But I think Twombly retains a real interest in the notion of the encrypted writing. He was fascinated by Michelangelo's, by Leonardo's secret writing, and he has a number of works where he only produces something that looks like writing but is not writing, and you have to simply guess what these letters, one thing called letter of resignation, particularly in the late 60s, very passionate, desperate appearing missive in many images. So I just want to point up that notion of the coded and the encrypted in Twombly's work. Okay, I want to move on to a related subject and to different poets, and the question of erotic vision. Twombly's work repeatedly invokes another modern Greek poet, C.P. Cavafy, who, of course, had to conceal his homosexuality in late 19th century Alexandria, early 20th century. Twombly knew both E.M. Forster's and W.H. Auden's appreciative essays about Cavafy, and one of his 4 copies of different Cavafy translations contains his markings. This is actually the 1980 edition translated by Keeley and Sherrard. Below Cavafy's Thermopylae, a poem called Thermopylae, a very bitter poem about betrayal, we find the scribbled outline of Twombly's own 1991 sculpture, a sculpture inscribed with lines from Cavafy's poem. So there's the sculpture, and here is the real thing, the real McCoy. It's also at Houston in the Menil, and has written along the bottom Thermopylae, but it also has these lines inscribed on it, and has a very visceral feeling about it. It's all bandages covered in plaster over a wicker framework, and this memorial sculpture with its verdict on war and on the betrayal of the soldier in war. Now, the same book contains another marked up page, a page from Cavafy's When They Come Alive, a poem of 1916. Twombly has edited the Keeley and Sherrard translation, numbering the lines, and as you see, cutting the third line, the original third line, all together, and that's on your handout. Try to keep them, poet, those erotic visions of yours, however few of them there are that can be stilled. That's what he's crossed out. Put them half hidden in your lines. Try to hold them, poet, when they come alive in your mind at night or in the noonday brightness. And you can see underneath, Twombly has written his own emphatic injunction. Try to keep them, poets. Try to keep them. Shorn of its parenthesis, Cavafy's 6-line poem, of course, is much stronger. Try to keep them, poet, those erotic visions of yours, put them half hidden in your lines. Now, sexuality in Twombly's art is often all over the place, literally. It takes the form of unabashed scatological signs that punctuate his work, like flying missiles, penises, breasts, semen, buttocks, and so on. Cavafy's lines on the hidden life of erotic vision points to perhaps a more subtle form of erotic vision, a kind of self-outing. One poem that inspired Twombly is Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, a poem whose homoerotic subtext belies its overtly heterosexual love plot. Now, Twombly's luscious version of Venus and Adonis in 1978 is littered with heart and buttock-shaped signs, heart-shaped, buttock-shaped, hard to tell the difference. Ostensibly, it takes up the Ovidian narrative that had inspired erotic paintings by Titian, Rubens, and Poussin. And you'll remember, of course, that in Book 10 of the Metamorphoses, Venus's ardent wooing of Adonis culminates in his death. He's gored by a boar and transformed into an anemone. The engorged organs of Twombly's painting emphasize something more like the polymorphous perversity of the encounter. His detour towards the loose subtext and sly phallicism of Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, which of course is like Shakespeare's sonnets, was dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. His detour towards this poem emerges, I think, more clearly from a number of related 1978 works on paper, each of which contains, like this one, the image of a kind of fold-out book with flower scribbles, the big shade of the dead Adonis, and some other items, which I'll come back to. Shakespeare's Adonis, those of you who know the poem, will know that Shakespeare's Adonis is a pouting boy who won't cooperate with a love goddess. He's unapt and frosty in desire, and he's assailed by a very frustrated Venus. He thinks only of the chase. I know not love, quoth he, nor will not know it, unless it be a boar, a B-O-A-R, a boar, and then I hunt it, and then I chase it. So the love that Adonis doesn't know, or dares not name, if you like, takes the form of a weeping wound to his groin delivered by a boar's amorous tusk. So there were three in this relationship, as Lady Diana famously said, a woman, a boy, and a boar, not two. Now, each version of Twombly's Venus and Adonis repeats the motif of Adonis's flower-like shade, the shade of A, along with a series of cleft buttock shapes and a phallus poised in suggestive proximity. You can see there. It's pretty clear. The fold-out books, of course, point also to the flowers of poetry, a combined spectacle of literary and erotic pleasure. If you like, erotic visions half hidden in the lines. And as Pound wrote pithily, poetry is the thing that will out. Okay, I'm going to move to my final example. Twombly repeatedly returned to Guy Davenport's translation of late Greek Bronze Age poets, Archilochus, Sappho, Altman. His favorite was he quotes Sappho a lot, but his favorite was the sardonic soldier poet, Archilochus, whom he quotes on a grim sculpture, Epitaph, 1992. And the lines he quotes are, "In the hospitality of war, we left them their dead as a gift to remember us by." This is, of course, the period of the First Gulf War with its road of death and charred bodies, and Twombly knew some of the Middle Eastern sites, archaeological sites, well, and had immense affection for them. And what I think you're seeing is the white plaster Paris again on an obscenely bulging box with this grim epitaph. In the Twombly archive, assembled by his partner, surviving transcripts in Twombly's hand show him copying out another poem by Archilochus at least 4 times. It's not like his drawings, where he often did the same drawing again and again, slightly different, as if trying to work out a problem. And he copied this poem out a number of times. Here it is transcribed almost exactly with its brackets and lacunae, this shred of Alexandrian paper, torn left side, right, top and bottom in the middle, reads, "You, if, river, so, I then alone." And what you will notice is that practically all of it has been inserted by the so-called translator, Davenport. And here is the marked text, and you'll observe a missing line, which I'll come back to, and it's on your handout too. The third one on your handout. Davenport's translation makes the fate of a torn shred of Alexandrian paper part of the poem's aura. Papyrus fragments, he writes, this is Davenport, papyrus fragments, scrap paper from the households of Alexandria, with which third-class mummies were wrapped, all else is lost. So salvaged from its repurposing, almost nothing survives. Twombly called such fragments mirabilia. And you'll have noticed that the transcript Twombly made follows, if I can go back to it, follows almost exactly Davenport, except for one line with holes in the middle, top and bottom with holes in the middle. The holes get cut. This single deletion wonderfully underlines, doubles down on the gaps in an already lacunose, gappy text. Faint traces of travel and solitude linger on between the lines. The precursor poem is Pound's haunting four-word Sapphic translation, so-called Sapphic, the poem called Papyrus of 1916. Some of you may know this poem, spring, ... too long, ... Gongula. It's just a poem of absolutely wonderful, evocative longing with the lacunae really part of the entire poem, of its incompleteness. Davenport, of course, makes the material depredations of time part of his translation. Shredded, torn, abraded, used as wrappings for mummies, Archilochus's fragment survives only as an unspecified you, a lonely I, and a conditional grammatical relation, if, then, so. No verb, apart from the single intransitive verb supplied by the translator, and the verb is reads. Reads, in the middle, reads. Erosion begins with the mark, scribbling, scratching, scarifying, cutting into a permeable surface, subject to the action of time. Twombly's 1956 application for a second travel fellowship to take him back to Italy refers to what he calls his own deeply aesthetic sense of eroded or ancient surfaces of time. The act of erasure, one should note, also forms part of modernist practice. The iconic instance is Robert Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning drawing of 1953, erased de Kooning drawing, where the title is a supreme gesture either of overcoming, as it were, a towering artistic precursor, or of the absence that is constitutive of the so-called drawing. Twombly often treats the surface of his canvas like the distressed surfaces of graffiti-covered Roman walls, deliberately dirtying and smearing his canvas or paper, or painting his canvases right up on the wall, pinned on the wall, and allowing the drips to run down. Sometimes he overpaints his own writing, and he refers to this. He says sometimes that's like memory. Memory, it's there, then it's not there. Or sometimes it's just second thoughts. He's painting out what he didn't like. But he makes it hard to read, both by his handwriting and by the layers of white paint that sometimes cover it. So illegibility becomes part of the artwork. I want to end by taking this up a little bit. Twombly said, I never really separated painting and literature because I've always used reference, a fascinating quotation. And he also confessed, I'm not an abstractionist completely. Poetry, an exceptionally loaded form of writing, if you like, when it comes to reference, is one of the languages, I think, of Twombly's incomplete abstractionism. It brings another dimension into painting, if you like, temporality as well. Poetry is a time art or a verbal idea of action. That's Fenollosa, translated by poetry, action poetry, if you like, at once gesture, mark, and performance. Twombly's quotations both summon the viewer to attentiveness and potentially exclude the would-be reader. Books and poetry serve as bearers of fugitive or hidden meaning. At a distance, his written marks elude the act of reading altogether, or perhaps allude to graphic systems more generally, as in the huge blackboard paintings. Twombly's practice, I want to argue, undermines the idea of a kind of fully paid-up member of the Dead Poets Society. Roland Barthes loved and wrote about Twombly and tried to emulate him. He said he tried to do a Twombly, and then he found it was very hard. Roland Barthes' contrast between the writerly, the scriptible text, and the text that is author-controlled or readerly, lisible, is apropos to his writing about Twombly. And in fact, his wonderful essays about Twombly are just the same period, and he makes that distinction. Twombly reclaims writing for drawing and reading for painting. but he also privileges what I've called the arts of illegibility. Twombly is hard to read, unreadily, if you like, negative in its own way. And books are just the beginning of the story. So I hope you'll have a chance to read on. I'll stop there. I'd be very happy to talk more, show you more pictures, or take questions if anything wasn't clear, or led you to reflect. Yes?
I guess my question is, did Cy Twombly pretty much always incorporate writing in his work, or do you see it at a certain point that he brings it? He starts to do
that's very interesting. I think there's certainly phases when he seems to do it more. I think at the end of his life he did it more. He was more interested in, he did a whole series of rose paintings, which are full of quotations from Bachmann and Rilke and T.S. Eliot, actually. But I think early on, there's some wonderful works in the 70s where he's working with Theocritus, and he's quite clearly got, he's quoting bits of Theocritus. And in the early 60s, and the late 50s, sometimes words and short quotations appear, particularly from Sappho, that seem to have been very resonant for him. So I think it's a fairly continuous practice, but I think I haven't sort of put it on a grid and looked, but I think you probably could say that as he became more settled, his ownership of books gave him more opportunities to think about the texts that he might be interested in. And quite characteristically, he often, having started with a bashed-up paperback, he then subsequently got himself a really lovely edition. For instance, the 50 Days in Ilium, which is his sort of shrinklet version of the Iliad. He used Pope's translation, and very closely, he clearly had read it. But he then went off later and bought himself a really beautiful second edition of the poem, in its big binding and everything. So sometimes I think it happened in reverse. He got interested in something and inspired by something, and then got off on it in a way, But I think what I was perhaps trying to emphasize was that poetry, people said things like you couldn't come out of, his contemporaries who were writers said you couldn't come out of Black Mountain College without loving Rilke. So, there was this sort of nexus of poetry and art, and people not really making a distinction between dancing, performing, painting, sculpting, and writing poetry, or reading poetry. Susan.
It was really interesting. I get from you very insightfully what his project is all about, and was wondering, on the one hand, he seems to be a painter whose method, whose process is what's most important. So that, for instance, the poems that he used, he's not really interested in the meaning of the poems, right? They become implements, instruments. Yeah. They become stuff to use as an artist.
Found objects.
Yeah, right. But and I wonder, in your book, do you ever do, and you said you have other images, do you ever do any analyses really of a painting? In other words, starting with the painting rather than the kind of process behind it, because it seems that the method that you use of finding that process behind it is precisely the one you have to use to get at what he's doing. But I wonder what happens when you look at it the other way.
Well, I think that's a wonderful question, and of course it really touches on this whole question of how far the meaning of a painting can be regarded as determined by something you've dug up and said, oh, that's what this poem meant to him. It was. And of course, as a literary critic, I'm always tempted to kind of go back and look at the context and think about what kind of poem this was and why he might have been interested in it. But I think there are plenty of examples kind of t'other way on. Yes, in the book. I certainly would think so. But there's sometimes examples that are quite puzzling. For instance, I think huge painting, Say Goodbye, Guitarras, with its wonderful title. He played around with different titles, alluding to Keats earlier, alluding to Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. And it clearly was a painting that just would not come together. And eventually he wrote on it. So that was where the process went backwards. And he wrote on it some of these quotations from Rilke, quotations that emphasized the kind of onceness, the kind of once only, one time only. So I think certainly, and I think, I was intrigued by the idea that he used poetry to solve a technical problem that he couldn't solve otherwise, like this huge unfinished painting. It's not quite the answer you want. I think there are other paintings where there's a relation, for instance, between his own painting called School of Athens and the enormous Raphael, very beautiful Raphael and Parnassus, Raphael frescoes with the same names. And there he's clearly working out how a modern painter can possibly respond to the painting of the past without making it completely new. And of course, one way he makes it new is to make it flat. He really makes the surface what's important and not the illusionistic element of those wonderful frescoes which are on awkward walls and so on. I don't know if that's a little bit of an answer to a very interesting question.
Mary, I very much enjoyed your talk. The question that comes to mind is, what was his audience?
What's his audience?
Audience. I mean, he was painting for literary people, artists, his friends, but was there a market that he was thinking about as well?
That also is an extremely interesting question, because he clearly was, at one point, had a huge problem because he fell out of the structure of American painting in the early 60s, which was becoming minimalism and pop, for instance. He was absolutely not there. And he did a really, I think it's a really terrible series of paintings for an exhibition in 1964 called A Discourse on Commodus, who was a mad emperor. They're really strange paintings, and they were dramatically unsuccessful. And he was regarded as having tanked, basically. The most promising of the three had tanked. There was Johns and Reichenberg was forging ahead in their own way, very interested in pop also. And what he did, and what he says about that, was he said, I was the happiest man alive because I could do exactly what I wanted, and nobody took any notice of me. And he didn't come back, as it were, until the late 60s with these huge blackboard paintings, which interestingly kind of recapitulated, looped right back to some lost paintings that he did quite as in the early 50s, which were entirely kind of stenographic, black with a sort of stenographic writing, which he did. There are photographs of them in Reichenberg's studio in the early 60s. And I think his career is quite often sort of like that. He kind of loops back and recapitulates. But Reichenberg also said something very interesting about him, that you really never knew what he was going to do. He never talked about it. He just did his own thing. Whereas Reichenberg was tremendously communicative about everything he did. And that was one of his appealing gifts, I think, to be part of a performing crowd, in a sense. And I think Twombly did, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate his solitude, because he did connect with the very interesting scene in the early 60s in Rome, where there was a lot of stuff going on, arte povera and so on. And he kept on drawing, and the drawing is very private in a way. The catalogues of his drawings that have come out are fascinating because they show him addressing the problems that he was fascinated by in different ways over a long period, drawing all the time. Whenever he got somewhere, he would lay out the paper on the floor and start drawing. And I think that's an important part of his way of working and his way of shutting out what else was going on. So I think it's a long answer to the question. I think his audience, he sort of created his own audience, actually. People loved his stuff because it wasn't like things that other people are doing. If you go around an art gallery, if you go around, as I recently did, the Galleria dell'Arte Moderna in Rome, where there are just a couple of Twomblys, he looks completely unlike anything else.
Yes.
Yes. And there's somebody there too.
So, Professor, in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how you had suspended your psychoanalytic approach in exploring his biography, and I was wondering, is it confined to him because he was a writer and a visual artist at the same time, or do you tend not to take the approach no matter which?
Well, I actually, of course, did have plenty of theories about Twombly, for instance, about what it meant for him to have a gay relationship, to marry, and then again to return to a very intense gay, very long lasted all his life, gay relationship, and what toll that takes on somebody in Italy, even in a very sophisticated cosmopolitan environment, which he was in, certainly. And I think what I didn't want to do was to sort of put that sort of hypothesis forward, although I think it of course lurks around in thinking about why he was so interested in the Orpheus story and in the drawings he made of Orpheus, which are strange things that just go like that or just like that, or very totally abstract. But the idea of looking back with some regret, I think, is often present in his work. He can be a very elegiac artist. I did find at one moment he was very much taken up in France at one point in the 70s by French post-structuralists, not only but I'm temporarily blanking his name, but Philippe Soler, who wrote about him. They wrote about him, and they wrote about him in psychoanalytic terms, of course, because psychoanalysis and Lacan and also Green were very sort of central to how people, critics, literary theorists were thinking about both language and art at that moment. And I did in one chapter allow myself to think about his interest in what you might call psyche through his fascination with Keats's poem Ode to Psyche, which he returns to a number of occasions in the early 60s. But I just didn't want to. I didn't at the time I was writing it. I didn't know that I could get access to his letters. There are actually a lot of letters, and I didn't want to write that kind of book. I didn't feel that was the kind of book I felt I could do, and that it was in some sense I'm not very keen on deducing psychoanalytic readings from the work that sort of displace the work in some ways. That just wasn't what I wanted to do. So I tried to keep a firm lid on my own interest in psychoanalysis, except as I say it snuck in on one occasion. Does that? Yeah. There are some. I mean, he was clearly. I just sort of missed meeting him, but he was clearly a very intelligent and interesting person. But I don't think he was given to theorizing his own work. I think he did rather dislike that. He said, "I've poured my guts out into the painting. Why do I have to talk about it?" And so, yeah. Somebody was over there. Yes, two people. Not Roger. Okay, that's not you. Yeah, Roger. Oh, and no, and
okay.
No, both of you.
I'll try and make this a lot simpler. So I'm the lucky person who has the book back here. You talked a lot about the literary references, and I think referred to the sort of aesthetic qualities of the pictorial quotations.
Right.
And when I say pictorial, I mean his written quotations as pictorial aesthetic objects.
Right.
And we also have, I was really struck by this, a really incredibly beautiful spread, the summer solstice
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one of the first
Yes,
examples
it is
you
wonderful.
showed.
The object is so beautiful with all the
Absolutely.
paint stains. And
Just absolutely gorgeous spread from one of the first examples that you showed of the paint stains and all of his editorial marks, and that is obviously, to those of us who are privileged to see it, an aesthetic object as well. Yes. What I had never seen before was the in-between, the in-between.
Yes.
The studies, the quotations that he made of the books, and so what I wanted to ask you about is how would you talk about that archival material? Would you think of those as sketches? Would you think of those as are those artistic musings, or are they more in, I mean, how would you classify them?
Well, I think that is a fascinating question, and you know, here he's written red petals in there, and sometimes he's quite literal about color, and likes making little charts and saying, you know, I think of brown is earth and red is blood and so on and so forth, red petals, but and of course that is a beautiful page with some of the colors that he used.
The ones that you showed us were completely clean and were only in pencil. Was that the same for all of them, or just the examples that you showed?
What was the first bit of what you said?
The examples that you showed us were completely clean.
Which ones?
And had no other markings except for the words and
that.
Well,
that's in a painting.
No, it was further on. There. Archilochus.
Yeah, well, that's a piece of paper, and in fact, one of the things about that is that unfortunately, it was reproduced for me from the archive. It came out very pink, and so they whitened it. They kind of bleached it for the image, but it doesn't. So you don't get the sense of paper. And he did these on several bits of paper. One of them was squared paper, actually. That's on a plain piece of paper, so you don't see the paperness of the paper. But I think, as an object, it was a considerable pleasure in creating that beautiful transcript on a beautiful piece of paper, though the texture of the paper has been lost in the reproduction. For some reason, when they were scanned in Gaeta, it came out with a slightly pinkish tone, which is not what it ought to have been. But you're right, it is beautifully written, and it shows that if he wanted to write well, he could. He wanted to write neatly. I think he was very interested in the idea of the calligraphic, the graphic. And in fact, he has a whole riff where he does talk about that. He says, I got interested in pseudo-Japanese writing. He has a whole series of paintings that look like pseudo-Japanese writing. So the writing itself, I think, it comes to seem for him part of the art object, but has a potential for art. And the important thing about writing is that it isn't quite drawing, because you do something else with it, you read it, but it nonetheless is a line, and a line that is can be elaborated in certain ways. Can be, you know, it's the untranslatable, if you like the dots, the full stops, and the gaps. You know, it's the there's a word for it, the incidentals, which are part of the book as object that we often just take for granted in the book as object, and which are lost, of course, in the electronic reproduction. So I think he was as aware as somebody who constantly uses paper is of what happens when you put a mark on a piece of paper. It's not simply a magical reproduction. It's something that is itself a work, a kind of work. So I'm not quite sure if you're coming to that from a sort of bibliographical position of somebody who handles books and feels them. And he clearly had a great himself, a feeling for books, I think. like to handle them and mess them about and make them his. Does that kind of, I think I'm really just sort of elaborating some of the, sorry?
What size is that?
Just little.
Oh, okay.
Just little. Yeah. But very, you can see, you know, he's really, he got it all right, except he's crossed out one line. So it's like making a fair copy. And he did refer to these extraordinary kind of found objects as mirabilia. So I am terrified that these books will get lost, actually. Nobody, I think, has really, you know, done a you know, the librarian in me wants to, you know, somebody to go and do a catalogue. And I try to persuade Twombly's son that, you know, he should catalogue these books, or have them catalogued. But so far, there's a rather casual attitude to them. So, yeah.
I think I know there are other questions. I'm going to suggest that we continue the conversation over cookies and books at the back of the room. And thank you so much.
Thank you.